The stars didn't used to frighten us. There was a time, not so long ago, measured in the slow arithmetic of civilizations, when we looked up at the night sky and saw possibility. We mapped those pinprick lights with paper charts and copper instruments, then silicon and light, then finally with our own eyes, pressed against viewports of ships we'd built with our own hands, fueled by our own audacity. We were not invited to the galaxy. We were not discovered by some benevolent elder race who stretched out a welcoming hand and said, "Come, join us. There is a seat at the table with your name on it." There was no fanfare, no first contact delegation bearing gifts and universal translators. What we got, on a Tuesday morning in the 14th year of the Kepler expansion, was a single tight beam transmission received by the relay station orbiting Proxima Centauri b, translated by 3 separate AI systems before any human being read it, and then classified for 11 days while 7 different governments argued about what to do. The message, in its entirety, once rendered into English, said, "You are in a controlled zone. Cease expansion. Await instruction." That was it. No name. No signature, no explanation of who they were, what the zone was, or what instruction we were supposed to await. Just 6 words delivered with the casual authority of a species that had clearly never been told no. For 11 days, governments argued. On the 12th day, a 23-year-old technician named Priya Vasantha, who had been on the Proxima relay station for 9 months, and had read the classified transmission 17 times, sent a response without authorization. She used the station's full power array and the same tight beam frequency. Her message said, "Who's asking?" She lost her job over it. She became famous later, so it worked out. But at the time, the only thing that message accomplished was proving that the signal had a return address, because 44 hours later they answered, and 6 months after that they arrived. The Vithrani compact was not one species. That was the first thing humans got wrong in every piece of media that tried to imagine them in the months between arrival and first contact. We pictured one alien species, tall, gray, large-eyed, the cliché. What descended from the 3 vessels that decelerated into our solar system with a kind of contemptuous slowness was something more complicated. The compact was a governing body. 7 species under one administrative framework, the oldest of which, the Sarathi, had been spacefaring for approximately 40,000 years. 40,000 years. When early humans were painting bison on cave walls in what would become southern France, the Sarathi were already arguing about FTL tariff regulations. They sent a delegation to Earth in smaller craft, and the delegation was polite. That word kept coming up in the early reports, polite. Not warm, not curious, not even particularly interested. Polite, in the way that a building inspector is polite when they arrive to tell you your house doesn't meet code. Transactional, efficient. They attended the summit in Geneva. They ate nothing, drank nothing, accepted no gifts. They brought a translation matrix that worked almost perfectly, which told us they'd had time to study us before we knew they were doing it. Their lead diplomat was a Sarathi named Speculative. She was tall, nearly 2.5 meters, with skin like polished basalt and 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line across her face. She sat across from the Secretary General of the United Earth Assembly, and she explained the situation without apparent emotion. The Orion arm of the Milky Way was administered. Not owned, not colonized, but administered. Managed for stability. Resource flows monitored. Expansion routes coordinated. The compact had been doing this for longer than our civilization had existed, and the system worked. New species were incorporated periodically. There was a process. We would be assigned a designation, granted a restricted zone of operation, and in approximately 300 years, standard compact time, which worked out to roughly 280 Earth years, we would be evaluated for expanded status. 300 years. The Secretary General, to his considerable credit, kept his voice level when he asked what happened if humanity declined to comply. Speculative paused for exactly 2 seconds. They knew this later because the whole thing was recorded from 11 different angles, and then she said, "Species that attempt unauthorized expansion are quarantined. It has not been necessary to do more than that in some time, but the mechanisms remain available." She didn't say what the mechanisms were. She didn't need to. So humanity complied. What choice did we have? We had 12 extrasolar colonies at this point, all of them struggling, most of them dependent on Earth supply lines, none of them capable of independent survival if something catastrophic happened. We had fusion drives and rail guns and electromagnetic shielding, and we were enormously proud of all of it, because we had built every piece from nothing, from scratch, from the raw intellectual output of a species that had only cracked orbit 300 years before. But they had 40,000 years on us. They had 7 species worth of science and engineering and history. They had ships that made ours look like paper boats on an ocean. We complied. And for 63 years it was fine. Tense and humiliating in ways that no official communique ever quite captured, but fine. Humanity stayed in its designated zone. We developed our colonies. We built. We argued with each other, which we were always going to do regardless of circumstances. But we also quietly, deliberately, with the focused patience of people who have been told to wait in a room with no windows and can hear the party happening outside, we learned. The compact had rules about technology transfer. You could not share certain classes of knowledge with restricted species. This was sensible policy from their perspective. From ours, it was maddening. But the compact also had trade, because trade was how you ran an interstellar economy. And trade meant contact, and contact meant humans being humans. We are, and this cannot be overstated, relentless. Not reckless, relentless. There is a difference. Reckless means you don't think about consequences. Relentless means you think about them, you account for them, you plan around them, and then you keep going anyway. A Vithrani compact administrative report from year 40 of what they called the Terran integration period described human commercial representatives as exhausting in a way that seemed nearly admiring. They negotiated everything. They had an opinion about everything. They formed relationships, personal ones, with alien counterparts, and they leveraged those relationships to understand more than they were supposed to. They didn't steal technology. They reverse-engineered it from legally acquired goods, from things observed during sanctioned trade visits, from conversations that were entirely within the rules but happened to cover topics that were educational. They published academic papers on things they had figured out themselves that happened to run parallel to compact science that was technically restricted. Speculative, who was still the Sarathi lead diplomat because 40 years was nothing to a species that routinely lived 3 centuries, flagged no fewer than 94 of those papers for review. All 94 came back clean. Humanity had not violated the terms of the integration agreement. She reportedly reviewed the findings, looked at her aide and said, "They are doing something. I cannot determine what." She was right, but she wouldn't find out what for another 23 years. Commander DARA Osimensa had been in the Compact Security Auxiliary for 11 years, the small, deliberately understaffed human unit that the Compact allowed to operate, technically a military organization, practically a way of keeping tabs on what humanity was doing in the defense space. She was 39 years old, 164 centimeters tall, and had a reputation among her compact supervisors as cooperative, diligent, and completely unremarkable. She was, in fact, the 4th most important person in the most significant clandestine project humanity had ever attempted. and she had spent 11 years making absolutely certain that nothing about her suggested this. The project had a classified name that no one outside of a 9-person coordinating committee knew. Internally, the people who worked on it called it the long game. This was a human phrase that the compact had not yet encountered, and they found it untranslatable when it eventually surfaced, which tells you something about the difference between their thinking and ours. The long game was not a weapons program. That's what the compact would have expected, what any rational actor with a species' pride at stake would expect. A secret weapons program. Reverse-engineered compact drive technology crammed into human ships, stockpiled warheads, hidden fleets. They found some of those eventually. The things humanity wanted them to find, the buried programs that were real enough to be convincing and small enough to be containable. Controlled discoveries. Misdirection. The long game was something else. It was a legal strategy. 63 years of patient work, linguistic analysis, historical research conducted through legitimate academic channels, trade law scholarship, the careful cultivation of relationships with species inside the compact who had their own complicated feelings about Sarathi dominance. 63 years of humans being exactly what humans are when they are highly motivated and pointed at a problem. Clever, tireless, creative, and willing to operate on a timescale that most species would find exhausting. The Compact's integration agreement, the document that had effectively been imposed on humanity with a polite smile and the implied threat of quarantine, had a clause that no one had thought much about in 400 years. It was a relic of an older version of the Compact, from before the Sarathi achieved their current political dominance. It had survived every revision of the agreement because it was phrased in language so archaic that automated legal review systems consistently tagged it as ceremonial non-binding. It was not ceremonial. It was not non-binding. It was a mechanism for what the original founders of the Compact, not the Sarathi, who had joined later as a conquering power absorbing an existing institution, had called the petition of equal standing. And the mechanism, properly invoked, required the Compact's full administrative council to hold a formal hearing, with representation, testimony, and a binding judgment. It had never been used. There was, as far as the Compact's legal records showed, no precedent. Humanity had spent 63 years building the precedent. The day DARA Mensa walked into the Vithrani Compact's regional administrative hub on Kepler Station, with 47 other human representatives, 2 legal AI systems running on hardware that complied with every Compact technology regulation, and a physical document printed on actual paper because the original Compact charter required physical documentation for certain classes of submission. The station's AI flagged the event as a routine administrative visit. She had timed this. She had timed everything. The Compact's annual administrative cycle had a 12-day window between the close of one legislative session and the beginning of the next, during which standing committees were technically dissolved, and the full council was the only body with jurisdictional authority. It was a procedural quirk that everyone in the Compact knew about, and no one had ever thought to exploit because no one had ever needed to. DARA walked to the administrative intake desk, where a Pelhari functionary. The Pelhari were one of the smaller Compact species, and had historically been among the most sympathetic to human concerns, a relationship that had been carefully and genuinely cultivated over decades, looked up at her with his 3 amber eyes and said nothing, but his secondary eyelids flickered in what the humans who worked here knew was surprise. DARA placed the document on the desk. She said, in Compact standard, which she spoke without an accent after 20 years of practice, We are filing a petition of equal standing under Article 11, Section 4 of the original Vithrani Compact Charter, ratified in the 412th year of the Common Compact Calendar. We have 47 co-signatories representing every major human governmental body, documentation of compliance with all integration agreement terms for the entirety of our restricted period, evidence of technological and cultural development meeting the original Charter's criteria for expanded status, and formal requests for council hearing. I have a receipt copy for your records. The Pelhari functionary looked at the document. He looked at DARA. He looked at the 47 humans standing behind her, all of them in formal attire, all of them very, very still. He said, "This will need to be escalated." DARA said, "I know. Here is the clause requiring response within 6 standard days. I've highlighted it. The next 6 days were the most scrutinized period in human history since the first moon landing. Word got out within hours because word always gets out, and what followed was a complicated mixture of panic, excitement, and a kind of breathless disbelief that this was really happening. Governments that had known about the long game for years were suddenly faced with having to acknowledge it publicly. Governments that hadn't known, and there were some, because 9 people can keep a secret if they are sufficiently disciplined and have spent 6 decades being disciplined, were furious and then, gradually, unified. There is nothing like an external threat to consolidate human solidarity, and the possibility that the compact might simply decide to disregard the petition, or to invoke those unspecified quarantine mechanisms, focused minds wonderfully. Vescalith requested an immediate meeting with DARA. DARA's legal team advised her to attend, because declining would be both rude and potentially admissible against them, but to record everything and agree to nothing. The meeting was on Kepler Station, in a room that the compact used for high-level discussions, curved walls of something that looked like dark glass and probably was several things simultaneously, ambient lighting that shifted toward blue when occupants were calm, and toward orange when they were not. DARA noticed the light was orange before she sat down. Vescalith had not changed in ways that DARA could perceive. The Sarathi lived long. She sat across the table with 2 aides and looked at DARA with all 4 of her horizontal eyes and said, in a tone that was still technically polite, "Explain what you believe you have accomplished." DARA said, "We've filed a legal petition under the existing charter. We believe we meet the criteria for expanded status, and we're asking for the hearing the charter guarantees." Vescalith said, "Article 11, Section 4 was considered dormant." DARA said, "It was considered dormant. The legal team I have outside this room, which includes 3 scholars who have published extensively on original compact charter law and who are available to testify, would be happy to discuss the distinction between considered dormant and actually dormant. The charter uses specific language about abeyance that requires a formal council vote to invoke. No such vote was ever taken. The provision is active." One of the aides said something to Vescalith in Sarathi, a language humans had only partially cracked, and Vescalith responded without moving any other part of her face, which was one of the things that made Sarathi so difficult to read. Then she looked back at DARA and said, "You understand that the council will not simply grant this petition. There will be opposition." DARA said, "I know. We're not asking for it to be granted without opposition. We're asking for the hearing. The fair one. The one the charter says we get." Another pause. The light in the room, DARA would note in her debrief, had shifted from orange toward something closer to yellow. Vescalith said, "You have been planning this for a long time. It wasn't a question." DARA answered it anyway. She said, "We're human. We plan." The hearing was scheduled because the compact, for all its flaws, was in fact a functioning legal institution, and the charter provision was, once 17 of the compact's most senior legal scholars were compelled to examine it in the 6-day window, unambiguously valid. Ignoring it would require the compact to formally repudiate its own founding document, and that was a precedent that several of the smaller member species found distinctly uncomfortable. The hearing would take place at the compact's primary administrative center, Veth Prime, the station that had served as the political heart of the compact for 600 years. It orbited a star called Earl 4 by humans, who had cataloged it decades ago and had never been allowed to visit it. Humanity was going to Veth Prime. The preparation for the hearing took 4 months. DARA led the legal team, which expanded from 47 to over 300 scholars, diplomats, linguists, historians, and one extraordinary woman named Dr. Amara Akafer, who had spent 30 years studying the comparative legal traditions of compact member species, and who spoke 7 of their languages and understood 2 more, and who had a memory so precise that she was sometimes used as a primary source in academic papers about things she had witnessed personally. The team that was not supposed to exist, and then suddenly did, and had to be integrated with the team that had been quietly told it might someday be needed. There were friction points. There were arguments. There was one incident in month 2 that involved a shouting match between a constitutional lawyer from Bangalore and a xenolinguist from Oslo that required 3 mediators to resolve. And then it was resolved, and they went back to work, because they were human and the deadline existed, and there was no option but to keep going. The compact opposition was formidable. The Sarathi, who stood to lose the most if humanity achieved expanded status, because the current arrangement benefited them specifically, retained the most senior legal minds in the compact, not just Sarathi scholars. They hired across species lines, which told you how seriously they were taking this. They filed preliminary objections on 14 separate grounds. 12 were dismissed. 2 were allowed, which meant the scope of the hearing was slightly narrower than the human team had hoped, but not critically so. They also did something that DARA had anticipated and prepared for. They released a carefully curated set of documents showing every human violation of the integration agreement's supplementary protocols over 63 years. The list was long. The violations were real, most of them minor, all of them investigated and closed at the time, but the cumulative picture was designed to make humanity look like a species that couldn't be trusted with expanded access. Dr. Akafer, when she saw the list, laughed. Not dismissively, a genuine, delighted laugh. She said, "They've made our argument for us." Because the point wasn't that humans were perfectly compliant. The point was that they were compliant enough and persistent enough and functional enough to merit the hearing. The violations on that list, most of them were from the first decade. The rate had declined. The trend was visible. And the compact's own assessment mechanisms, which were bureaucratic and slow but technically precise, had cleared them at the time. Reopening them now was legally questionable in itself. Dr. Akafer prepared a 17-page rebuttal that reduced the list to context, and then built from that context an argument so elegant that 3 of the compact's own legal scholars later cited it in academic work. Veth Prime was enormous. Nothing quite prepares you for the scale of something built by a civilization that has had 40,000 years to build it. The station was not, technically, a station. It was a structure so large that it had its own gravitational influence. A hollow sphere 14 kilometers in diameter with interior surfaces that housed forests and oceans and cities, all of it rotating to provide gravity, lit by a captured light source at its center. 600 years of additions and modifications had given it the layered, organic quality of something that had grown rather than been built. The human delegation arrived in 3 ships. 3 ships. That was the limit the compact had specified, and the human team had pushed the mass and crew capacity of those ships to their absolute limits. Every person on board a justified necessity. Every gram of equipment accounted for on a manifest that had been audited twice by compact inspectors. They docked in a section of Veth Prime that was clearly designed for restricted status delegations. Smaller, less elaborate, the space allocated proportional to humanity's current standing. DARA looked at it and felt something complicated. The smallness of it was a reminder of what they were fighting against. But the fact that they were here at all, inside Veth Prime, was a reminder of how far they'd come. The council chamber seated the representatives of all compact member species. The Sarathi had the largest delegation, naturally. But the Pelhari were there, and the Vithrani, the species the compact was named for, who had founded it and who still held a technical veto they had not used in 300 years. And the Kurath, who were the most ancient of the member species after the Sarathi and who had a complicated relationship with them. And the Davori, who were small and numerous and had 17 seats compared to every other species 3. And the Shanketh and the Osiri, 7 species, the ones who decided humanity's place in the galaxy. DARA stood at the petitioner's position. The floor of the chamber was below the council tiers, which was a design that was not accidental, and she looked up at them and she thought, "We've been here before. Not here specifically, but this feeling, standing in a room where every structural choice is designed to communicate your smallness. Humans had been here 1,000 times in their own history. Standing in rooms where the power was arranged above you and the message of the room itself was that you did not belong. And they had learned over centuries that the way you survive that room is not by pretending the power dynamic doesn't exist. It's by being so prepared, so precise, so undeniably correct, that the people in the high seats have no choice but to listen." She began. The hearing lasted 11 days. On the first day, the human team established the legal foundation. Article 11, Section 4, its history, its validity, its applicability. Dr. Akaffer was devastating on the specific language of the abeyance clause, and the 2 compact legal scholars brought in to dispute her conceded more than they'd intended to under her questioning. On the second and third days, they presented the evidence of compliance. Not perfect compliance. They had never intended to claim that. They presented the trend, the documented improvement, the systems humanity had built to manage its own behavior within the integration agreement. Systems that were more sophisticated than anything the compact had required or expected. A species that builds voluntary compliance infrastructure is a species that has internalized the values, not just the rules. On the 4th day, the Sarathi opposition presented its case, and it was good. It was genuinely good, the scale of human violations in Year 8. The unauthorized communications relay that had operated for 6 months before being discovered and shut down. The technical argument that the petition mechanism was intended for species already within the compact as full members, not for species in integration. DARA listened and took notes and felt the weight of it, because she was not arrogant enough to pretend it carried no weight. On the 5th day, Dr. Akaffer rebutted the technical argument about the petition mechanism's intended scope with a piece of original charter history that had taken 3 years to locate and authenticate, and which definitively showed that the petition was designed for exactly this circumstance. 2 of the Sarathi opposition team visibly reacted to this. The compact legal scholars who were watching, not involved, just watching, because the scholarly community had been riveted by this from the start, noted in their real-time commentary that this was the moment the momentum shifted. On the sixth day, a Kurath council member asked DARA a question that was not on the prepared list. Why should we trust you? Not legally. Why should we trust you as a species? The chamber went very quiet. DARA had prepared for legal questions, historical questions, technical questions. She had prepared for hostility and for procedural challenges. She had not prepared for that question, which was not a legal question at all. She stood in the well of the chamber for 4 seconds, which felt like 4 years, and then she said this. You shouldn't. The silence deepened. She said, not automatically, not without cause. Trust isn't something you extend in advance of evidence, it's something you extend in response to it. We're not asking you to trust us because we want you to or because we're asking nicely. We're asking you to look at the evidence and make a reasoned judgment, and then to honor the charter your founders wrote, which says that when species meet the criteria, they get the seat. Not if we like them, not if we trust them, if they meet the criteria. We're not here because we're likable. We're here because we've done the work and the work is documented and the charter says this is what happens next. She paused. Then she said, but since you asked and I want to answer the real question, not just the legal one, here is what I would point to. We have been in the zone you gave us for 63 years. We have 63 years of evidence. We are not a peaceful species. Our own history proves that beyond any argument, but we are a learning species. We learn from failure faster than almost anything I've observed in the comparative records. We adapt. We build institutions. We make rules for ourselves, and then slowly we follow them. Not because someone forced us to, because we decided they were the right rules. That is the evidence I would offer on the question of trust. Not that we're trustworthy in some abstract, inherent sense. That we are a species that becomes more trustworthy over time, and that the direction of the trend is visible to anyone who looks. The Kurath council member was silent for a long time. Then he said, continue. On the 11th day, the council voted. The vote required a simple majority of seated member species, 4 of 7, to advance the petition to the next stage, which was a formal status review, with a 6-month timeline and binding outcomes. It was not a final determination of humanity's status. It was the door to the room where the final determination would happen, but it was the door, and it had been locked for 63 years. The Sarathi voted no. The Osiri, who had close political ties to the Sarathi, voted no. That was expected. The Davori voted yes. The Pelhari voted yes. Those were expected too. The Kurath voted after a deliberation period of 47 minutes, during which the chamber was completely silent except for the low background hum of Veth Prime's rotation. And then the Kurath voted yes. 3-2. 1 vote to go. The Vithrani had not yet voted, and they had not voted on anything in 300 years, and no one was certain what they would do, and the Shanketh were the last, and their position had been genuinely unreadable through 11 days of proceedings. The Vithrani voted yes, 4-2. Before the Shanketh cast their vote, 4 was enough. 4 was the majority. The petition was advanced. Dara Osai-Mensa walked out of the council chamber and into the corridor, and she stopped, and she put one hand against the wall of Veth Prime, a wall that had existed for 600 years, that had been touched by 100 species, that had never in its history been touched by a human being, and she breathed. Behind her, the team was erupting. Contained, professional eruption. They were still on Veth Prime, still under observation, still needed to be what they had spent 11 days proving they were. But eruption nonetheless. Hands clasped, voices kept low but vibrating with something that had no clinical name, that weird specific euphoria of winning a thing you have been working toward for so long that part of you had stopped believing the winning was real. Dara pressed her hand against the wall and breathed and thought about 63 years of people who hadn't been in this room. The technicians and the scholars and the diplomats and the trade representatives, and the 9 people who started the long game, and all the people who had carried it without knowing what they were carrying, who had just been humans doing human things, being relentless, being curious, being constitutionally incapable of accepting that a room with a closed door was simply closed. She thought about Priya Vasantha, who had sent an unauthorized message from Proxima Centauri relay station 43 years ago, and who was now 71 years old, and watching the news feed from her home in Chennai with her grandchildren, who did not fully understand what they were watching, but understood that their grandmother was crying, and that it was the good kind. She thought about the first generation of colonists on humanity's 12 worlds, and the 46 worlds that had been settled since, who had built those lives under the shadow of a ceiling they weren't allowed to touch. She pressed her hand against the wall and felt the temperature of it, cooler than she expected, with a faint vibration that was probably structural, the deep mechanical heartbeat of the station. She thought, "We are still here." The 6-month review was not easy. It was not a formality. The Sarathi fought every stage of it with every tool available to them within the process, because they were operating within the process now, which was the point. That was what the charter was for. That was why the long game had targeted the legal architecture rather than the power structure. You cannot fight your way past 40,000 years of military and technological development, but you can make them fight you in a room with rules. In a room with rules, 63 years of preparation is a very different kind of weapon. The review evaluated technology, governance, resource management, interspecies conduct, treaty compliance, and what the Charter called cultural coherence, a metric that the Sarathi tried to use to argue that humanity's internal conflicts demonstrated insufficient coherence for expanded status. Dr. Akafar's team cross-referenced this metric against every species in the compact's own historical records at the equivalent stage of their development, and produced a comparison that the Sarathi opposition had no effective answer to. Humans fighting each other was not disqualifying. Humans with political institutions capable of unifying for purposes like this hearing, that was the metric. And they had those. They had built those. Imperfect, arguing, maddening human institutions that somehow, when the moment required it, could put 300 people in a room and point them all at the same problem. At the end of the 6 months, the review board issued its determination. Humanity was granted candidate standing, the tier below full member status, with significantly expanded rights of movement, trade access, and legal standing. Not the seat. Not yet, but the step before the seat. It had been expected to take 280 years. It took 63. There is a moment in almost every important human story where someone pauses and says, "Was it worth it?" And the question is genuinely complicated here. 63 years of living under restriction, of watching alien ships move freely through space that humans had dreamed about, of raising children in the shadow of a ceiling you kept hitting, of the daily quiet indignity of being told that you were not ready, that you were unproven, that the space between the stars was managed territory and your job was to wait. Was it worth it? The people who had lived it mostly said, "Ask the ones who come after us," because that is the shape of the long game. That is the shape of most human achievement, actually. The people who start a thing are rarely the people who finish it. The people who plant trees don't necessarily sit in the shade. The 9 people who began this work knew that. They planned for their own obsolescence. They built institutions instead of cults of personality, systems instead of dependencies on specific individuals, because they understood that 63 years was longer than most careers and definitely longer than most patients. DARA Osimensa was 49 years old when the determination came through. She had given 11 years to this, and the 11 years before that to preparing for it, and the decade before that to the education that made the preparation possible. She went home, Earth, the city of Accra, a house she had not spent enough time in, and she was there for 2 days before she started working on the next phase. That was who she was. That was who they all were. Vescalith requested a final meeting after the determination. Not formal, nothing on record. Just the two of them in a small room on Kepler Station, which was neutral ground and somewhere between their respective homes. They sat across from each other. The light in the room was steady, neutral. No orange. Vescalith said, "I misjudged you." Dara said, "In what sense?" Vescalith said, "I understood that you were capable. I understood that you were motivated. I did not understand that." She paused, and for the first time in their acquaintance, Dara had the impression of a Sarathi actually searching for a word, the patience. We had not encountered it before. The species that reach compact notice quickly are typically the ones who push, who expand aggressively, who make themselves impossible to ignore. "You were quiet," Dara said. "We've had a lot of practice being quiet. Being quiet while we work is different from being still." Vescalith was silent for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want, ultimately? Not the petition, not the expanded status. What does humanity want from the compact?" Dara thought about this. It was a genuine question, she judged, not hostile, curious. Maybe the first genuinely curious question Vescalith had ever asked her. She said, "The same thing we've always wanted. The same thing every version of us has wanted since the first one looked at the horizon and wondered what was on the other side. To see it all of it. Every system and every world and every strange thing that exists out there in the dark. We